15 minutes before my wedding, my father texted me, "I'm not walking you down the aisle in that dress." I read it twice before my brain really caught up to it. Then another message popped up right underneath. From my mother. "You're embarrassing us." I just stood there in the bridal suite staring at my phone while somebody down the hall laughed too loudly, and a church piano stumbled through the beginning of Canon in D. For a second the whole room felt crooked, like the floor had shifted under me. My maid of honor Tasha was behind me steaming one of the bridesmaids' dresses with the tiny hotel iron we'd practically stolen from the Hampton Inn. "Maya," she asked softly. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was looking at myself in the mirror, at the dress, at my body. The satin was bright white under the yellow vanity lights, but the skin above it told a different story. The scars along my shoulder had faded some over the years, but not completely. Same with the surgery marks around my knee. The skin there still pulled strangely when I stood too long. And then there was the weight. Not an imaginary 5 pounds women apologize for at brunch. Real weight, steroid weight, recovery weight, depression weight. The kind that settles into your face and waist and arms after your body stops belonging to you for a while. My mother hated that dress because it showed all of it. I lifted my hand and touched the scar near my collarbone. "This is who I am now," I whispered. Tasha heard me. She set the iron down carefully. "You look beautiful." I laughed a little at that, not because she was lying, because she sounded angry saying it. 3 weeks earlier, my mother had stood in the same bridal shop outside Atlanta, tugging at the sleeve of another dress and saying, "This one is much more flattering." Flattering. That word had followed me for 2 years. After Afghanistan, after the surgeries, after the Army Medical Board retired me earlier than I wanted. "You have such a pretty face still." Maybe avoid sleeveless. "You carried your weight differently before." Before. People loved that word too. Before I limped in cold weather. Before I gained 40 pounds. Before I stopped looking like the version of me everybody was proud to display at church dinners and Veterans Day parades. I tried calling my father. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Declined. That hurt worse than the text. Because for one stupid second I thought maybe he'd hear my voice and remember I was still his daughter. Tasha walked over slowly. "Your parents left the chapel." I looked up. "What?" "They got in their car maybe 5 minutes ago." I stared at her. "Linda was crying," she added carefully. "Your dad looked mad." I sat down hard in the chair by the makeup counter. Not crying yet. Just numb. Outside the room I could hear folding chairs scraping across the chapel floor, guests settling in. My wedding was still happening whether I was ready or not. I looked down at the dress again. Part of me wanted to rip it off immediately. I actually reached for the zipper. Tasha stopped me. "Number. I can wear the other one." "The one your mother picked," she asked. I didn't answer. Because yes, I could already picture it hanging in the garment bag. Long sleeves, heavy lace, high neckline, safe. A dress designed to hide evidence. Tasha crouched in front of me. "Do you love Daniel?" "Of course I do." "Then marry him?" Easy for her to say. Tasha hadn't spent her whole life earning love through achievement. Straight A's, Army scholarship, officer training, deployments, promotions, smile for the church bulletin, make the family proud. And the second I stopped looking impressive, my parents started looking at me differently. Not all at once. Little things. My mother asking if I was really eating carbs again. My father telling me maybe retirement was for the best after my knee surgery, because people notice when officers let themselves go. The worst part was how hard I kept trying anyway. Even after everything, I still wanted my dad to walk me down the aisle. A knock sounded at the door. One of the chapel coordinators stepped inside, nervous as hell. "Captain Bennett." I nodded. "There's a retired command sergeant major outside asking for you." That caught my attention immediately. "He says he served with your father," she continued. "And with you." I frowned. Then I heard it. A cane tapping slowly against the hallway floor. "Cloak! Cloak! Cloak!" The coordinator stepped aside. And there he was. Frank Delaney. 72 years old and somehow still terrifying. His army dress blues looked older than some of the guests arriving downstairs, but they were perfectly pressed. The medals across his chest caught the light every time he moved. His left hand shook a little from age, though he tried hard to hide it by gripping the cane tighter. But his posture, still pure Sergeant Major. Straight spine, chin up, eyes sharp enough to cut through steel. For a second I forgot to breathe. "Sergeant Major," I said automatically. He looked me over quietly. "Not my weight. Not my scars. Me." Then his eyes settled on the dress. You know, he said I spent 30 years around uniforms. I swallowed hard. And if that dress tells the truth about what you survived, he continued, then it's the finest uniform in this building. That did it. That was the sentence that finally broke me. I covered my mouth and started crying so hard I had to lean forward in the chair. Not graceful crying either. Ugly crying. The kind where your whole chest caves in because somebody finally saw the thing you'd been carrying alone. Tasha turned away to give me a second. Delaney waited. After a minute, he cleared his throat. Your father should be ashamed of himself. I wiped my eyes carefully. Please don't hate him. The old man's face softened a little. That's the problem, Captain, he said quietly. I knew your father when he was young enough to be better than this. Then he held out his arm. Now, he said, are we going to keep your future husband waiting or not? I stared at him. At the medals. At the cane. At the old soldier standing there offering me the dignity my own father had thrown away 15 minutes before my wedding. And slowly I stood up. The strange thing about humiliation is how fast your body adjusts to it. By the time Sergeant Major Delaney helped me down the hallway toward the chapel doors, my tears had mostly dried. My hands still shook a little, but the panic had settled into something heavier. Colder. Like exhaustion. Delaney walked beside me slowly, cane tapping against the hardwood floor every few seconds. Cloac. Cloac. Cloak. Neither of us spoke for a minute. At the end of the hallway, Tasha stopped to fix the train of my dress one last time, while guests continued filtering into the chapel downstairs. I could hear muffled conversations. Somebody laughing near the coffee station. Ice clinking in plastic cups. Normal wedding sounds. Which somehow made everything feel even stranger. You hungry? Delaney asked suddenly. I blinked at him. What? You've got that look soldiers get when they forget to eat and start making emotional decisions. Despite myself, I laughed softly. There she is, he muttered. I leaned against the wall carefully to take pressure off my knee. I can't believe they left. Yes, you can. That shut me up. Because he was right. Part of me absolutely could believe it. Not the exact moment, maybe. Not the cruelty of the text itself. But the direction things had been heading. Yeah. Deep down I'd seen it coming for a while. My parents loved me best when I looked like proof they'd done life correctly. Back when I was Captain Maya Bennett. Fort Moore. Army logistics officer, sharp uniform, marathon medals, hair in a tight bun, smiling in family photos while my father stood beside me like he personally invented patriotism. Things were easier for them when my body looked disciplined, useful, presentable. I grew up outside Clarksville, Tennessee in one of those neighborhoods where everybody waves but still tracks everybody else's business through kitchen windows. My father owned a construction company. My mother taught Sunday school and treated church potlucks like Olympic events. Appearances mattered. The lawn mattered. The truck mattered. The Christmas cards mattered. And I mattered too, as long as I fit the picture. When I joined the Army at 19, my father bragged about me constantly. My little girl can outshoot most men. My daughter's an officer. My Maya's serving her country. He loved saying my Maya back then. At church, men shook his hand harder after they found out I deployed overseas. Women told my mother she must be so proud. And she was. Until I came home different. Not broken exactly. Just altered. The knee injury happened during a supply transfer overseas. One bad landing climbing out of a transport vehicle carrying too much weight. Torn ligaments, surgery, complications after surgery, more procedures after that. Then the steroids. God, the steroids. Nobody warns you how quickly they can change your body. 1 year earlier, I'd been running 6 miles before sunrise. Suddenly, I was winded walking through a grocery store parking lot carrying bottled water. The weight gain hit fast. My face changed first. Then my stomach. Then my arms. I remember the first time my mother looked uncomfortable seeing me. We were at Cracker Barrel near Knoxville, maybe 6 months after my medical retirement. I reached for a biscuit and she said, "Real casual, honey. Are you still supposed to be eating bread?" Like she was asking about the weather. I stopped reaching for the biscuit. That's how these things happen sometimes, not with screaming, with tiny cuts. Across from me in the chapel hallway, Delaney lowered himself carefully onto a folding chair with the sound of a man whose joints argued with gravity daily. "You know, your father wasn't always this hard," he said. I stared at him. "You knew him back then. Long time ago." He rubbed at one knuckle slowly before continuing. "Richard Bennett used to be funny." I almost laughed at that. My father hadn't been funny in at least 15 years. "He had a good laugh," Delaney said. Big booming idiot laugh. Could hear it across a motor pool. What happened to him? The old man gave me a look that only comes from age. The kind where somebody's seen enough life to know there usually isn't one clean answer. Time, he said finally. Pride, fear, same thing that happens to a lot of men. That part I understood more than I wanted to. My father had spent his entire life building things with his hands. Houses, decks, garages, businesses, reputation. Then suddenly he was in his 60s. The younger contractors got the bigger jobs now. His blood sugar stayed high no matter what he ate. His hands cramped up when he held tools too long. He stopped sleeping well. Started drinking bourbon every night in the garage while pretending he was checking invoices. The world had started moving past him. And then there was me, the daughter who used to represent strength. Now, limping slightly and shopping in plus-size sections, she pretended not to notice. I think looking at me terrified him, because he saw what happens when a body stops cooperating. And instead of grieving with me, he got angry. Daniel never did that. That man met me after the army already took its pound of flesh. He met me during physical therapy when I was sweaty, limping, frustrated, and cussing at resistance bands in a rehab center outside Columbus. He was there because he'd thrown his back out carrying an unconscious man from a house fire. First thing he ever said to me was, "You look like you're about 2 minutes away from assaulting gym equipment." I snorted, remembering it. What, Delaney asked. Just thinking about Daniel. The old sergeant major nodded once like that explained everything. And honestly, it kinda did. Daniel wasn't perfect. Lord knows he wasn't. The man lost his reading glasses 3 times a day and thought every medical issue on earth could somehow be fixed with grilled meat and ibuprofen. But he was kind. Steady. Safe. A few months after we started dating, I broke down one night because none of my old dress clothes fit anymore. I remember standing in my bedroom surrounded by jeans I couldn't button, while Daniel sat on the edge of the bed folding laundry terribly. "I don't even recognize myself," I told him. He got quiet for a second. Then he said, "Maya, I watched my wife die in hospice. I watched life leave somebody I loved one breath at a time. I stopped crying long enough to look at him." He shrugged gently. "Scars and weight don't scare me," he said. "That tells me you stayed alive." Nobody had ever said it like that before. Not survival as damage. Survival as proof. A burst of laughter came from downstairs in the chapel. Wedding guests. Real life continuing whether families behaved or not. Then I heard heels clicking fast down the hallway. My Aunt Carol rounded the corner holding her purse against her chest. She froze when she saw me standing there with Delaney. "Oh," she said awkwardly. "There you are." Her smile looked nervous. Too nervous. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Nothing, sweetheart." "Aunt Carol." She sighed heavily. Then she glanced toward Delaney before lowering her voice. "Your daddy's upset." I stared at her blankly. "Upset enough to leave his own daughter 15 minutes before her wedding?" I asked. Carol winced. "Well, he said things." Something inside me tightened. What things? She hesitated too long, and that hesitation told me whatever came next would stay with me. Finally, she said quietly, "Richard said you used to make him proud." The hallway suddenly felt too warm. Carol kept going before she lost her nerve. "He said he doesn't even know what to tell people anymore." For a second, I honestly couldn't breathe. Not because it surprised me, because hearing it out loud made it real. I looked down at my dress, at my arms, at the scars my mother hated. And for the first time all day, something changed inside me. Not rage, not revenge, just clarity. I looked up at Delaney. I don't want to spend the rest of my life trying to earn love from people who keep moving the finish line. The old man stood slowly leaning on his cane. Then he offered me his arm again. "Good," he said. "Now let's go get you married." Right before the chapel doors opened, I almost lost my nerve again. Not because of my parents. Because suddenly the whole thing felt real. The music had started downstairs. Guests were seated. Somewhere inside that chapel was Daniel standing at the altar, probably pretending not to panic while sweating through his dress shirt. And I was about to walk into the room without my father. That hurt no matter how calm I tried to act. Delaney adjusted the cuff of his dress blues jacket with slow, careful movements. Arthritis made his fingers stiff, but he still fussed over his uniform like inspection day mattered. Some habits never leave soldiers. "You ready?" he asked. "No," I admitted. That made him smile. "Good, means you understand marriage." I laughed once through my nerves. Tasha opened the chapel doors slightly to peek inside. Then she turned back toward us. Everybody's seated. The piano music floated faintly through the hallway. My stomach twisted. Delaney held out his arm. And that's when I noticed his hand shaking harder than before. "You okay?" I asked quietly. "I'm 72 years old," he said dryly. "Everything hurts." Then he lowered his voice. "But I wouldn't miss this for the world." I swallowed hard and slipped my arm through his. The fabric of his jacket felt cool and stiff against my hand. Formal military wool, the kind that smells faintly like old cedar closets and brass polish. Tasha fixed the back of my dress one last time. Then she whispered, "Make them choke on their own opinions." I snorted so suddenly I nearly ruined my makeup. "That's deeply un-Christian of you. Good thing I skipped church last Sunday." The chapel coordinator gave us the signal. And then the doors opened. For one terrifying second, nobody moved. I could feel every pair of eyes in the room turning toward us. The chapel wasn't huge, maybe 80 guests total, white wooden pews, tall windows glowing gold from the late afternoon Georgia sun. Little battery candles flickering along the aisle because the church wouldn't allow real flames anymore after somebody's aunt almost set herself on fire at a Christmas service 2 years earlier. Everything suddenly looked painfully clear. I heard somebody inhale sharply near the front row. Then Delaney took the first step. Cloak. His cane struck the wooden floor. Cloak. Another step. The room stayed completely silent except for the soft piano and the measured sound of that cane. I felt my pulse hammering in my throat. But something strange happened as we walked. Nobody looked disgusted. Nobody looked embarrassed. People just looked emotional. An older man near the aisle stood slowly as we passed, Vietnam veteran hat on his head. His wife touched his arm gently, but he kept standing. Then another veteran stood. Then another. Not dramatically, no speeches, no attention-seeking nonsense. Just old soldiers recognizing one of their own. Or maybe recognizing what it costs to survive long enough to grow old in the first place. Delaney kept walking steadily beside me, though I could hear the strain in his breathing now. Cloak. Cloak. At the altar, Daniel saw us. And I swear that man looked seconds away from crying right there in front of God and everybody. His shoulders dropped the moment he saw me. Like he'd been holding his breath this whole time. He mouthed, "You're beautiful." Not performative. Not polished. Just honest. I felt my chest tighten. And then I saw movement near the back of the chapel. My father. He'd come back. For half a second, hope flared inside me so fast it actually hurt. Maybe he regretted leaving. Maybe he realized. Then I saw his face. Not guilt. Fear. Pure fear. Because he wasn't looking at me. He was staring at Frank Delaney. My father stopped moving completely. Delaney noticed immediately. Without breaking stride, the old sergeant major turned his head slightly toward the back row. The two men locked eyes. And suddenly my father looked 20 years younger and 10 times smaller. I felt Delaney's arm tighten slightly beneath my hand. "Been a long time, Richard," he said calmly. The piano player faltered for one awkward note before recovering. Nobody else in the room understood what was happening yet. But they could feel it. My father swallowed hard. Delaney's voice stayed level. "I wondered if you'd still recognize the sound of accountability." The air inside the chapel changed. You could feel it, like pressure before a thunderstorm. My father's jaw tightened instantly. And then something happened that almost broke my heart. Pure instinct. The man straightened his posture automatically. Shoulders back, chin lifted slightly. Like a young National Guard soldier standing in front of somebody who used to terrify him 35 years ago. I realized then this wasn't just discomfort. This was history. Ugly history. Daniel looked confused at the altar but stayed silent. Smart man. Delaney didn't say another word after that. He just kept walking me down the aisle. And honestly, that mattered more to me than if he'd exposed my father right there. Because he wasn't trying to hijack my wedding. He was protecting it. We finally reached the altar. My knee throbbed from the walk, but I barely noticed anymore. Delaney carefully placed my hand into Daniel's. Then he looked directly at him. "Take care of her," he said. Daniel nodded immediately. "Yes, Sergeant Major." Good answer. A few people laughed softly. Enough tension broke for everyone to breathe again. Then Delaney leaned closer to Daniel and added quietly, though I still heard it. "She's tougher than anybody in this room." Daniel glanced at me. "I know." That almost started me crying all over again. The ceremony began. Simple, small, real. Exactly what Daniel and I wanted. No giant ballroom, no horse-drawn carriage nonsense, no choreographed dances for social media. Just family. Well, most of them. Halfway through the vows, I looked toward the back of the chapel again. My father had finally sat down. But he looked terrible. Sweat darkened the collar of his shirt despite the air conditioning. His eyes kept drifting toward Delaney, sitting stiffly in the side pew near the front. like he was trying to calculate how much danger he was in. My mother sat beside him, clutching her purse with both hands. Even from across the room, I could tell she had no idea what was happening between those two men. But she knew enough to be nervous. And suddenly I understood something. My father wasn't ashamed of me anymore. Not in that moment. He was terrified the version of himself he'd spent decades hiding was about to walk into the reception ahead of him. The realization hit me so hard I nearly missed my cue during the vows. Daniel squeezed my hand gently. "You with me," he whispered. I looked at him. At the man who loved me exactly as I stood there. Scars, weight, limp, anger, all of it. And for the first time that day I felt steady again. "Yeah," I whispered back. This time I really meant it. If you've never been to a Southern wedding reception, let me explain something. People can absolutely despise each other while passing potato salad politely. That reception hall looked warm and cheerful on the outside. White tablecloths, mason jars with baby's breath, sweet tea sweating in giant plastic dispensers from Publix, somebody's cousin arranging barbecue sliders onto trays while pretending not to eavesdrop. Underneath all that, tension thick enough to spread on toast. Daniel and I had barely finished our first dance before I noticed people watching my parents. Not openly staring, Southern people are too trained for that. But they were watching. My father sat stiffly at a round table near the wall nursing bourbon he probably shouldn't have been drinking with his blood sugar issues. My mother kept smoothing invisible wrinkles from her dress while smiling too brightly at everybody who passed. The performance had started. I knew the routine. Act normal until the shame passes. Delaney sat across the room talking quietly with two older veterans from Daniel's side of the family. Every now and then I caught my father glancing toward him like a man waiting for a storm to hit the house. Daniel handed me a plate. "You need to eat something." "I'm not hungry." "Tough," he said. "You've had half a deviled egg and one emotional collapse today." That got a tired laugh out of me. We sat down together near the corner of the hall while his daughter Renee adjusted the phone she'd propped against the cake table to record speeches later. "You okay?" Daniel asked quietly. I looked around the room. At my wedding reception, honestly, I have no idea. He nodded like that made perfect sense. Then my mother approached. I saw it in her face immediately. Damage control mode. She sat beside me before I could object and took my hand with both of hers. "Maya," she said softly, "your father and I were emotional earlier." There it was. Not apology. "Weather report." I stayed quiet. "We just wanted today to be perfect," she continued. "You know weddings bring out big feelings." I looked at her carefully. My mother still looked beautiful in that polished Southern way. Hair sprayed into place, pearl earrings, makeup untouched despite everything. But she also looked older lately. Tired around the eyes. I wondered suddenly how long she spent every morning trying to hold time back with creams and hair dye, and pretending everything was still under control. Then she said the thing I knew she'd say eventually. "I was only trying to protect you." I almost laughed. "Protect me from what?" She lowered her voice immediately. "You know how people talk, especially about women." She glanced toward my arms briefly. People can be cruel when somebody gains weight. There it was. The same poison wrapped in softer paper. I set my fork down carefully. "Mom," I said quietly, "you weren't protecting me from people." Her expression tightened instantly. "You were protecting yourself from being embarrassed by me." Her face changed like I'd slapped her. "That is not fair." "No," I asked. "You have no idea what mothers carry." I stared at her for a second. Then something inside me finally stopped trying to keep the peace. "I managed fuel convoys in Afghanistan," I said evenly. "I tracked equipment personnel and supply routes while getting mortared at 2 a.m. I can survive people seeing my arms at a wedding." She blinked hard. "You're twisting this." "No," I said. "I'm finally saying it out loud." My father suddenly appeared beside the table. "Don't talk to your mother that way." Daniel stood before I even could. Not aggressive. Not loud. Just firm. And honestly, that calmness scared my father more than yelling would've. "Richard," Daniel said evenly, "you had the chance to stand beside her today." My father's jaw tightened. "You don't know our family." "You're right," Daniel replied. "Because if I understood leaving your daughter alone 15 minutes before her wedding, I'd be worried about myself." Silence. Around us, conversations had started slowing. People weren't pretending not to listen anymore. My father stepped closer. "This is between me and my daughter." "No," I said quietly. "You made it public when you walked out." That landed. I saw it hit him physically. Before he could answer, another voice cut across the room. "Still walking away when things get uncomfortable, Richard." Delaney. The entire hall seemed to freeze. My father went pale immediately. The old sergeant major approached slowly with his cane, every tap against the floor impossibly loud now. Cloak. 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 Nobody spoke. Delaney stopped a few feet away from our table. For a second I thought my father might actually leave again. Instead, he straightened his shoulders defensively. That was 35 years ago. The room got quieter somehow. Nobody knew what that meant yet. But now everybody understood there was a that. Delaney rested both hands on top of his cane. You know, he said calmly, most people get softer as they age. My father didn't answer. But some men, Delaney continued, spend so much energy hiding shame that they turn hard instead. My mother looked completely lost. Frank, she said carefully, what exactly is going on here? Delaney looked at her for a long moment. Then he answered gently, your husband never told you why he left the guard. My father snapped instantly. That's enough. But Delaney ignored him. In 1989, he said calmly, Richard ignored a safety protocol during a training exercise because he thought regulations slowed him down. I saw my father's face collapse inch by inch. A young soldier got hurt bad enough to lose his military career. Nobody moved. Not even the catering staff. My mother stared at my father like she'd never seen him before. You told me it was family reasons, she whispered. My father rubbed both hands over his face. It was an accident. Delaney nodded once. Yes, he said, it was. That surprised me. No cruelty, no dramatic attack. Just truth. My father looked suddenly ancient standing there. Older than 64. Older than I'd ever seen him. I already paid for that mistake, he muttered. Delaney's voice stayed calm. Then why punish your daughter every time she reminds you life changes people? That one hit. Hard. Because suddenly I understood it too. My father wasn't disgusted by weakness. He was terrified of it. Terrified of aging, of illness, of becoming fragile and unnecessary. And every time he looked at me, he saw proof it could happen to anybody. Even soldiers. Even his daughter. Even him. My father looked at me finally. Not the dress. Not the scars. Me. You don't understand what it's like, he said quietly, to lose who you were. I felt tears sting my eyes immediately, because that was the first honest thing he'd said all day. Maybe all year. I nodded slowly. Yes, I said, I do. The room stayed silent. I lost my career, I continued. I lost my body. I lost the version of me everybody applauded. My voice shook a little, then steadied again. But I didn't make other people suffer because of it. My father looked down at the floor, and for the first time in years, he looked ashamed for the right reason. Near the cake table, Renee suddenly cursed under her breath. Everybody turned. She held up her phone helplessly. I swear I was trying to stop recording and somehow switched it to selfie mode. A nervous burst of laughter rolled through the room. The tension cracked just enough for people to breathe again. Delaney raised his glass slightly toward me. To Captain Maya Bennett, he said. I groaned softly. Please don't make this weird. Too late. A few people chuckled. Delaney ignored me completely. Logistics officer. He continued pain in my ass for 6 straight years and still the only person I ever trusted to find missing equipment in the middle of a sandstorm. That got real laughter. Then applause. Not huge dramatic movie applause, real applause. Messy, warm, human. My father sat down slowly in his chair while people clapped for me. Nobody insulted him. Nobody humiliated him. But for the first time in his life, he had to sit quietly and watch people respect me without needing me smaller first. And honestly, that hurt him more than screaming ever could. Before the applause faded completely, my father looked up at me and said very quietly, I don't know how to talk to you anymore. I stared at him for a long moment. Then I answered, start with the truth. I swallowed once. And then try kindness. The morning after the wedding, Daniel and I drove north toward Blue Ridge in complete silence for almost an hour. Not bad silence, just tired silence. The kind that settles over people after an emotional storm finally passes. Georgia looked washed clean after overnight rain. Wet pine trees, fog hanging low over the hills, gas stations with faded Coca-Cola signs out front, church billboards warning people to repent before it was too late. I sat in the passenger seat barefoot, holding a styrofoam cup of terrible gas station coffee, while my knee throbbed under the blanket I'd wrapped around it. Daniel drove with both hands on the wheel like he was transporting explosives. You know, I said, eventually we're officially married now. Mm-hmm. You don't sound excited. I'm concentrating. On what? Not driving this truck off a mountain because my wife keeps distracting me. I smiled a little and looked out the window again. Wife. Still sounded strange. Good strange. We stayed in a tiny rental cabin outside town that smelled faintly like cedar wood and old coffee grounds. The furniture didn't match. The mattress leaned slightly to one side. There was a hot tub outside that looked like it had survived several wars. Perfect. Daniel carried our bags inside and immediately groaned while straightening back up. I pointed at him. There it is. What? The old man noise. That was not an old man noise. That was absolutely an old man noise. He pointed toward my knee brace sitting in the chair. We both sound like microwave popcorn when we stand up now. Let's stay humble. That made me laugh harder than it should have. Maybe because everything had hurt for so long. That first night, we ate leftover wedding cake straight out of the box using plastic forks from the cabin kitchen. No fancy honeymoon dinner. No champagne. Just carrot cake and silence and two exhausted people sitting under a ceiling fan that squeaked every 20 seconds. At some point, Daniel looked over at me carefully. You okay? I started to say yes automatically. Then stopped. Because honestly, not completely. The revenge part everyone imagines feels satisfying. It's never quite that clean. People think justice feels like fireworks. Most of the time it feels like grief finally getting tired. I set my fork down. I keep replaying it, I admitted quietly. The reception. My dad. Daniel nodded once. I stared down at the cake container. I spent so many years trying to make them proud again. The words came out softer than I expected. After the army. After the weight gain. After retirement. I shrugged helplessly. I kept thinking if I could just become easier to look at. Easier to explain. Maybe things would go back to normal. Daniel listened without interrupting. That's the stupid part, I whispered. Even after those texts, part of me still wanted him to walk me down the aisle. That's not stupid. I looked at him. That's being somebody's daughter. That one hurt. Because he understood. A few minutes later, Daniel went outside to check the hot tub while I cleaned up paper plates in the kitchen. That's where I finally cried. Not loud. Not dramatic. I just leaned both hands against the counter and cried quietly while looking out the little cabin window at the dark trees outside. I cried because my parents embarrassed me. I cried because I still loved them anyway. And I cried because something had ended at that wedding, whether anybody admitted it or not. Not the relationship entirely. But the version where I kept begging to be accepted exactly the way they preferred me packaged. That part was over. 3 days later, we drove back to Columbus. Real life waiting. Laundry, bills, physical therapy appointments. Daniel back at the fire station, me back to consulting work and pretending I enjoyed Zoom meetings. The world moves on surprisingly fast after life-changing moments. But little things had shifted. My Aunt Carol mailed me flowers with a note tucked inside. I should have spoken up years ago. Tasha sent me 6 blurry screenshots from different relatives gossiping in family group texts. Apparently, my mother had spent decades carefully maintaining an image of our family that cracked wide open in under 1 hour. Not because Delaney exposed them publicly. Because people finally saw what had been sitting there underneath all along. A week later, Delaney called me from a number I didn't recognize. You settling back into civilian misery, okay? He asked. I'm surviving. Good. Then silence. Older men do that sometimes. Call just to check if you're still standing. Before hanging up, he said, your father contacted me. That surprised me. What did he say? He asked if I thought he was a bad man. I leaned back slowly in my chair. What did you tell him? Delaney took his time answering. I told him bad men usually don't ask that question. That stayed with me. Because it was true. My father wasn't evil. Weak sometimes, proud, cruel when ashamed. But not evil. And somehow that made everything harder. About 3 months after the wedding, I got a text from him while standing in line at Publix buying dog food and paper towels. I recognized the number immediately. For a second, I considered ignoring it. Instead, I opened the message. I watched the wedding video. Then another text appeared. You looked strong. That was it. No apology. No explanation. Just those 4 words. And honestly, I stood there beside a display of discounted Halloween candy and cried harder than I had at the reception. Because I understood what that message really meant. My father still didn't know how to say sorry. But somewhere inside all that pride and shame and aging and fear, he finally saw me again. Not the body. Not the scars. Me. I didn't answer right away. A few hours later, sitting at home on the couch with Daniel asleep beside me and the TV muttering low in the background, I finally texted back. I was strong. Then I stared at the screen a while before typing one more sentence. I also deserved kindness. He never responded. But he didn't need to. These days, my parents and I keep limited contact. Holiday calls, occasional dinners, short conversations that stay carefully away from old wounds, and honestly, that boundary saved whatever relationship we had left. My mother still sometimes starts to comment on my weight before catching herself halfway through. My father talks more quietly now. Age has a way of sanding sharp edges off people whether they want it to or not. In our living room, there's one wedding photo framed on the bookshelf. Not the posed family portrait. Not the cake cutting. The one where I'm walking through the chapel beside Frank Delaney. He's slightly bent from arthritis. I'm holding his arm, both of us looking straight ahead. Whenever I see it, I think about something I learned too late. Blood gives you relatives, but loyalty is what makes people stay when life stops looking impressive. And sometimes the people who stand beside you at your worst become more family than the ones who only loved you at your best. If you've ever spent years trying to earn love by shrinking yourself for other people, I hope you stop someday. You deserve kindness that doesn't disappear the minute life changes you. And sometimes peace begins when you finally believe that yourself.